On this episode of China Uncensored, the CCP has been pushing farmers to move to the cities, but let's just say it's not all going according to plan. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. China has a serious problem with rural poverty. Rural households on average live off of only $4 a day. This is the problem for the Chinese Communist Party. When you think of China, they want you to think of rich cities with glistening skylines. But right now, a lot of China looks more like this. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say China has a serious problem with rural poverty? My favorite party mouthpiece, Global Times, is here once again to correct my misapprehensions. What I meant to say was that China is enlightening the world with ways to relieve rural poverty. Here's one way: change the definition of rural poverty. While the average of $4 a day might not sound like much, it's more than what the World Bank defines as extreme poverty. That line is set at $1.90 a day. One thing China did to lift people out of extreme poverty is lower the bar for what counts as extreme poverty. Instead of using the World Bank's $1.90 a day metric, China uses its own metric of just 90 cents. And with just that change in definition, the CCP has instantly lifted tens of millions of people out of extreme poverty into less extreme but still really bad poverty. They just leave that second part out when they gloat about poverty relief in state-run media. Of course, there's still tens of millions more living on less than 90 cents per day. But don't worry, most of China isn't in extreme poverty. Most of China is just what you might call pretty poor. According to the Pew Research Center, about 900 million Chinese people live off of between $1.90 and $10 a day. That's 2/3 of the country on less than $10 a day. But as the Global Times says, the great and glorious CCP is lifting people out of poverty, which, by the way, makes it sound like the people aren't doing anything themselves, they're just being lifted, which is incredibly far from the truth. This is all part of the CCP's lofty aspirations set in 2012 during the 18th National Party Congress to create a hukou society, a moderately well-off society. Yeah, you don't want to set the bar too high. Moderately well-off society. It's all about setting realistic goals for yourself. It's like making New Year's resolutions. Six-pack abs? Sounds like a lot of work. I'll settle for just being able to fit back into my jeans. Okay, my sweatpants. But there's another important way the Chinese Communist Party is tackling rural poverty. Simply take the rural poor and move them into cities. By 2020, the CCP wants 60% of the population living in cities. The CCP has set this as a top-down goal because they hope it will, on the one hand, alleviate poverty and, most importantly, give people jobs so they can make more money and buy more stuff. The Chinese economy over the next decade will rely more and more on domestic consumption rather than just exports. That's the only way to keep the Chinese economy growing, and a growing economy is key for the CCP to stay in power. So now you understand why they're so serious about alleviating rural poverty. So the CCP has given top-down directions to local officials that moving people into cities is an important goal. China already has 10 megacities with more than 10 million urban residents. The United States, by comparison, has 0. Even here in New York City, we have only 8.5 million, unless you count commuters from New Jersey, which we don't. But in China, life in the cities is better in a lot of ways. You've got better public transportation, for instance, and more places to buy cheeseburgers. Plus, the pollution makes for really beautiful sunsets. And in cities, the average income is a whopping $12 a day. Take that, rural poverty. Except there are a few problems with this urbanization plan. For one, as I mentioned, the push to relocate people to cities is a top-down government initiative. It rewards local officials for meeting certain migration targets, but not necessarily for providing support for the people once they've moved. As one woman who moved from her village to a big city told Financial Times, "There's no water there, no jobs there, nothing has been sorted out. There wasn't even water for flushing the toilet." It turns out her government-subsidized home in a town in Guizhou was actually worse than rural poverty, and she eventually moved back. Plus, urban centers are more expensive and don't have enough jobs, especially for people from the countryside whose job experience mainly revolves around farming. But that's okay. Rural migrants mostly carried out dirty, dangerous, and demeaning jobs, which urbanites were not willing to do. They'll never be appreciated, at least until Mike Rowe does the China edition. And even though public services are better in the cities, migrant workers don't always get access to them. You see, China doesn't have freedom of mobility like the United States, where someone from a farm in Nebraska can move without any restrictions to, say, Los Angeles to get a career in acting/bartending. China has something called hukou, the household registration system. Basically, it chains you to where you were born. If you have a rural hukou and you become a migrant worker in, say, Beijing, you won't be eligible to get certain jobs or to send your kids to free urban public schools or receive healthcare benefits the urban residents get. The hukou system turns you into a sort of illegal immigrant in your own country. And 60% of the Chinese population has rural hukous. Many migrant workers are forced to live wherever they can. For example, old underground bomb shelters. Although that might turn out to be a great place to live depending on how things go with North Korea. There is a way to change your hukou, but you have to pay a huge fee. The fee is larger and more difficult to obtain for more desirable places like Beijing. And keep in mind, if this is a more desirable place to live, you've got issues. There are about 21 million people living in Beijing. According to Financial Times, at least 8 million of those residents lack the coveted Beijing hukou. That's a third of Beijing's population, and equivalent to the entire population of New York City. That's why the central government's urbanization push is not so popular in the nation's capital. Beijing is actually putting a cap on the population. In fact, a recent essay by a Chinese blogger critiquing the so-called fake lives of Beijingers talks about migrant workers striving for over a decade to get an apartment the size of a bird cage. In one night, his essay got 5 million views. 2 days later, censors had scrubbed it from the internet. Presumably, they hired a migrant worker to do the scrubbing. But wait, maybe access to better education will at least help the children of these rural migrants. I mean, it's got to be better than that school in the Chinese countryside that's literally in a cave. Well, not if you're in Beijing. The local government has been demolishing migrant schools. And overcrowding in cities is making the major cities unlivable for anyone. The wealth gap is growing. And real estate is getting so expensive, many apartments sit empty. Plus, urban sprawl means 6-hour round-trip commutes are not unknown. I don't want to give the impression, though, that this urbanization movement is just making things worse in cities. It's also making things worse in the countryside. 1/3 of the children still living in the countryside are left behind children. That is, their parents are off trying to make a better life in the cities, and we all know how well that's going. And now, those children might not even get the benefit of cave schools. 3/4 of rural schools are being shut down. And fewer than 10% of rural students make it to senior high school. But don't worry, it's not like they don't have anything going for them. Some are being trained as cage fighters. So to sum up, the Chinese Communist Party wants people to move to cities. On one hand, this is to alleviate poverty, but more importantly, it's to turn more Chinese citizens into consumers. Unfortunately, the top-down directive is putting rural migrants into crummy situations where they lack basic services and find it hard to get good jobs. You know, life in that cave school is sounding pretty good. So what do you think of China's urbanization plans? Leave your comments below. Thanks for watching this episode of China Uncensored. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.